For thousands of years, Chinese peasants have lived and died on this land. Most of them were unable to make more than a bare subsistence living. But the land on which they depended was not their own. The oppressive landlord system dominated their lives. The plots that they worked were small, and what little they produced had to be shared with the landlord. It was a difficult and cruel life. The village was the center of life for the Chinese peasants and the heart of Chinese society. Even today, most of the country's 700 million people still live in villages. When the Communist Revolution took place in 1949, the villages of China were the first to feel its impact. The village, together with the family, represent the most enduring aspects of Chinese civilization. Since 1949, the communists have tried to make fundamental changes in both village and family life. To see something of these changes, we shall look at three very different villages. Because camera teams cannot move about freely in China, these case studies may not be entirely representative. Nevertheless, they do give us a glimpse of life in the villages of China today. One village, called SSu Ching, is in the heart of the rich Yangtze River Delta in South China, the most densely populated and productive region in the country. The second is Liu Ling, in the bleak upland country of Shenxi province in... And finally, still further north, on the steppes of Inner Mongolia, lies the village of Bei Jung Beliga. This is the White Horse Brigade in Bei Jung Beliga, a militia unit drawn from a community of 2,000 people. They're from one of 7 minority groups who live in this vast region. They're the descendants of the fierce nomadic Mongol tribes that conquered much of Europe and Asia in the days of Genghis Khan. Before 1949, they lived and traveled as their ancestors did, roaming the land, grazing and water for their herds. But shortly after the Communist Revolution, they were organized into a commune. Their herds and lands became the common property of the villagers. Every man is now part of a working team, and every team is divided in turn into small working units. The communists' aim is to improve the herds and also to turn these Mongols into settled farmers. But even though they're tied closer to the land than ever before, the Mongols of Bei Jung Beliga are not yet farmers. The Mongols take pride in their past, their work, and their culture. The communists have tried to win them over by giving them better conditions. But the families still live in their traditional yurts, which are covered with thick felt blankets. Family life has changed little from the past, except perhaps that the families are bigger than ever before. the people still live on the traditional diet of millet and sour milk. However, some aspects of life have improved in recent years. A medical clinic has been set up, and infant mortality has been greatly reduced. Ten years ago, there were only 5 wells in the village. Today, there are 54. And for the first time, a tractor is working the land. The communists are also trying quietly to alter traditions. The Mongols are Lama Buddhists, but young people are no longer encouraged to become priests. When these elders die, the monastery in Bei Jung Beliga may die with them. One tradition that has survived the communist change is the ancient festival of the harvest. This is a visiting communist cultural team. Their job is to spread the communist doctrine among the Mongol people. Their trip to the festival reveals the subtle ways in which the communists use tradition for propaganda purposes. In the old days, the princes and lamas held the festival to thank the gods for a good harvest. Today, the thanks are given to Chairman Mao Zedong. Despite these efforts, the Mongols are still far removed from the mainstream of Chinese life. Though their way of life has certainly improved, the communists have not tried to alter it completely. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to do so. Our second village is Liu Ling in North China. The people who live here are native Chinese. This is the countryside around Liu Ling, a hilly landscape of terraced fields. The 600 peasants of Liu Ling were among the first to support the revolution, and shortly after 1949, they were organized into a commune. The commune leader explains that, as in many other parts of China, it has been necessary to increase food production. However, the terraced hillsides get very little rainwater. So an irrigation scheme was devised to use water from a nearby river. Unfortunately, the communists have not been able to provide the machinery needed for such an ambitious project. The villagers of Liu Ling now work together on land which they own in common. Before the revolution, it was the landowner who decided how much of the crops the farmers could keep for themselves. Today, this is decided by a committee of party leaders. But the method of threshing grain is still centuries old. Millet, corn and wheat are the staple crops grown by the villagers. Although the land is producing more food than ever before, most of it is used up by the members of the commune. There is little surplus to send to market. Village families live mainly on the grain ground by the women and the few other foods that can be grown on communal lands or small family plots. Family life in Liu Ling has changed little since the revolution. Most of the families live in caves. These are warm in winter and cool in summer. After the revolution, the communists tried to break up the family units by building dormitories for the men and women, but the attempt failed. Although the communists found it difficult to change the ways of the older people, they knew they could begin again with the young. These are the children from the villages around Liu Ling. They're members of the Young Pioneers, a communist youth group. Before the revolution, only a fraction of these children would have been taught to read and write. Today, illiteracy among young people in Liu Ling is unknown. Although Liu Ling has received relatively few material benefits from the revolution, the situation is quite different in our third village, SSu Ching, in the Yangtze Valley. These houses were once owned by the landlord. After the revolution, this system of landholding changed completely. The houses and fields became the property of a large commune composed of 23,000 people scattered in villages like SSu Ching. These fields, well watered by a network of irrigation canals, were already fertile and highly productive. The aim of the commune has been to make them still more productive. This has been achieved by reorganization of the peasants' work and the introduction of modern equipment, such as this new pumping station. As a result, these fields are producing more than ever before. There are now 5 crops a year. Before the revolution, there were only 2. This change can easily be seen. But what cannot be seen is the peasant's attitude towards the system which has brought about the change. The father of the Chang family is typical of these villages. This is his eldest son, carrying insecticide to the fields. This is his daughter. Like the rest of the family, she works on a production team. Chang, his wife, 4 children and mother-in-law live in this simple wooden house. Although the revolution has brought the Changs electricity, they still prepare their meals on a traditional straw-fired stove. As in Liu Ling, the communists tried to separate the members of the families in the village of SSu Ching, but here again, the scheme was a failure. Before the revolution, Father Chang rented a small plot of ground. Today, he and his youngest son work on the community-owned land. He is told what to do each day by the production team leader. Father Chang works for labor points rather than for money. He is then paid according to the number of points he earns. The system under which Father Chang works has changed drastically. But the communists have not been able to break the peasant's desire for his own land, and much of the food that the family eats comes from a small family plot. What Chang does not receive or grow, he can buy in the village. Unlike Liu Ling, the village of SSu Ching has a definite air of prosperity. The productivity of the land is reflected in stalls offering a variety and abundance of food. The visiting peasant can also buy freshly fried breadsticks. There are few signs of modern machinery in SSu Ching. and the tools that these farmers are buying were hammered into shape by village blacksmiths. Further along the main street of the village, there are other signs of change. Shoes that were once homemade are now produced by craftsmen in the village. The same is true of cloth and clothing. There is now a post box and a telephone. A new medical clinic has reduced infant mortality and extended the life expectancy of the village people. SSu Ching also has a cinema, which provides both entertainment and communist propaganda. The children now start school at a very early age, whereas before the revolution they had no education at all. The teacher is telling a story of an old grandmother who's been caught in the rain. A young girl has brought her umbrella to help the old lady. The moral is an ancient one, respect for old people. But the communist doctrine is also taught in the schools. The teacher explains that obedience to the party will earn the right to become young pioneers. And Chairman Mao is the first pioneer. A revolution has taken place in the villages of China. As we have seen, this revolution has achieved some undeniable successes. It has also created some major problems. The principle of state ownership of the land contrasts sharply with the peasant's wish to work on his own property. Despite the government's efforts to break down the family unit, it remains the heart of Chinese life. Both of these issues are potential sources of dissatisfaction. As a result of improved health services, the Chinese population is growing rapidly all the time. Whether the increase in food production can keep up with this growth remains to be seen. Ultimately, the success of the revolution will depend to a considerable extent upon finding a compromise between the communist ideals and the deep-rooted desire of the older peasants for some degree of individuality.